All right, perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to one of the last sessions here at Netroots Nation. Thank you all so much for coming. This session is called Is Equitable Development Possible? Or actually, it's called Equitable Development is Possible, the Lower Hill Story. So I'm very happy to have you all here. We have some very special people here in person as well as virtual. And before I ask each person to introduce themselves, actually we can do both. We can do both. So my name is Dr. Kimberly Ellis, and I am a resident here of the Historic Hill District in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And actually, almost everyone on our panel today is from the same neighborhood. And so we have a story to tell, and we're really excited about telling it. And we believe that this is easily a model for the rest of the country. I know that we're having a lot of difficult conversations in America right now, trying to strike this balance between monopoly capitalism and, rampant inequality and lack of equity. And so why would we have a conversation about having equitable development at this point in time? Isn't that a difficult conversation? Is that achievable in America? How is that possible? And that's the story that we're here to tell you about today. Today we have to the furthest left of me is our city councilman, Daniel Lavelle. He is literally our city councilman for District 6. So we want to give him a hand and a nice welcome. Next to him is Buccini M. Howes, and he is the Vice President of Development for Pittsburgh for Buccini Pollin Group. And on camera, on the far left, we have Tracy Lewis. She is now General Counsel for the Pittsburgh Penguins hockey team. Many of you all probably know about Pittsburgh, and she's on vacation. So I was like, please, Tracy, please join us wherever you are. And so she has joined us, and thank you so much, Tracy. And then next to Tracy is Dr. Diamante Walker, and she actually has a new position called the Scholar House, which she will tell you more about. And so all of us, with the exception of Tracy, are Historic Hill District residents. So the first thing I want to do is to actually play you all this video before we get into the deeper introductions and these questions. Oh dear. Okay, perfect. This was all set. So let me get a full screen as I've been directed. And so this is the project that we're going to be talking about. It is First National Bank Financial Center.
Pittsburgh, we hear you loud and clear. There's a major new development transforming the city center. Let's see what all the buzz is about. Introducing the Fnb Financial Center, located right in the heart of New Pittsburgh. The city's newest multi-tenant development in decades will deliver workspaces of the highest caliber and anchor the Lower Hill District. LEED Silver certified and sustainably designed with wellness in mind. Not just for the people, but for the planet too. All from the outside in and the ground up. But these workspaces and amenities go beyond the building. Stroll through the new Pace Park above the Crosstown Expressway and enter a neighborhood with good vibrations and a Hall of Fame swagger. Centrally located, there are endless options to beeline to the action at the Fnb Financial Center. It's where the city's top talent is headed. Now, let's take it to the bridge. The Fnb Financial Center is linking decades of Hill District heritage with a burgeoning downtown, driving economic inclusion through the largest community impact plan in the U.S. Here, you can be a part of something bigger. We're reconnecting neighborhoods, reinvesting in communities, reaffirming our community partnerships, and reimagining the way developments make positive social change. Designed for the people, crafted for the planet, and built for a purpose. All in perfect harmony. The Fnb Financial Center embodies the unbridled spirit of creativity and innovation that's given Pittsburgh its voice. And yes, Pittsburgh, we're listening.
Great. All right. So that is, that's our commercial for the First National Bank. And I wanted to show the video because it shows so many different aspects of this whole development. And, well, I won't toggle with this anymore. So under my other hat, I am the Director of Community Arts and Culture for the Buccini Pollin Group, and they are the developers of the Lower Hill site that you just saw. And so my first question, I'm just gonna ask everybody on the panel, can you tell us where you're from in terms of your neighborhood and what drew you to support this project, a bank no less? Why would you support this project? Give us your history in terms of your neighborhood and then why you would support this project.
All right. We good? Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. As already mentioned, my name is Daniel Lavelle. I serve on Pittsburgh City Council, but I am a resident of the Hill District community. And to be honest, it took a very long time for me to get around to support this project. When I took office in 2010, the former Civic Arena was still standing on the Lower Hill District site. And I had a conversation with the leadership of the Pittsburgh Penguins at that time. The goal was to get the arena demolished, but it was being nominated for historical status. And if it became historic, obviously it would not be demolished, and we would not be able to clear the way to redevelop the 28 acres. But in my conversation with them, I said, I will lead the charge to get the arena demolished so we can clear the way for the redevelopment of the Lower Hill if you agree to one thing, and that's to help me create black wealth. Because you're going to be building in a neighborhood that has an average income of $18,000. And if you agree to help this development rebuild the greater Hill District and reinvest in people, then I'll be able to get behind this development. They said, okay, we agree. How do we do that? I said, I have no idea. I'll get back to you. And then I went and convened a group of stakeholders. Buccini was one of them. And we began sitting amongst ourselves, thinking through how to create wealth for this underprivileged community. And it took a while, took months of meeting, but eventually we put all our best and greatest ideas on paper and gave it to the Pittsburgh Penguins and said, here's how we do it. They read and said, nah, we're not doing any of that. And my response was, cool, we just won't do any development. That then kicked off about 4 years of negotiations, where eventually their side of the table, along with my side of the table, would meet every other week for years, and eventually in 2014 signed what we call the CCIP, which stands for Community Collaboration Implementation Plan. It's really a community benefits agreement is what it is. And once we signed that, we said, okay, we can begin moving forward. That was 2014. We broke ground on this center in 2021. From 2014 to 2021, there were still a whole lot of other conversations about, now that we've agreed to this community benefits agreement, how are we going to implement it? And it took a lot of arguing, a lot of fussing. It took, to be honest, up until the new lead developer, Buccini Pollin Group, brought on Buccini, brought on Kimberly, and brought on other people from the community who we knew had our best interests in heart. This really didn't take off, to be frank. So it wasn't until we were able to get around a collective table and sort of iron out and say, here's how we're going to implement all the benefits that we've talked about. Here's how this office tower is going to spur $7 million into a special fund that will only get used to help redevelop the rest of the community. Here's how we can do all these creative things. And once we sort of got around an agreement, then I got supportive and was willing to go before the City Planning Commission, which had to approve it, was willing to go before the URA, the Urban Redevelopment Authority, of which I sit on that board, and approve this development to move forward, because I was then confident that this development would actually be to the explicit benefit of those living close by it, of African Americans in our entire region, and then the city at large.
Thank you. One moment, you guys. I just want to make sure that this gets put back up here. I wanted to get one.
What is this about?
Right there. Okay. Bomani?
So my name is Bo. Pardon me. Good afternoon, everyone. How you doing? So my name is Bomani House. Vice President of Development for the Pittsburgh office, the Buccini Pollin Group, the developer that is responsible for building out the lower 28 acres. And so I'm just going to give you a little bit of context. This 28-acre site was one of some 3,900 communities across the country that had been targeted for redlining. And so the use of eminent domain knocked out this neighborhood. My grandparents were right in the heart of that neighborhood and experienced that redlining movement that began to segregate America. And so years later, in our attempts to kind of reclaim the land, this part of our neighborhood, so many of us began to organize and form a series of working groups to kind of begin setting the vision and political strategy for how we would be able to leverage power, both political and economic. Back after the CCIP that Councilman Lavelle spoke to in 2014 was signed, this Community Collaborative Implementation Plan, which is 7-point system or 7 principles of development, kind of like guiding principles, one of them being wealth building. I had threw my hat in the ring and said, I'm going to go ahead and push forward from the development side. I'm a real estate investor. I've been investing for quite some time. Since 2005, I've been in real estate. And so we've started forming alliances around how we could actually implement the plan, right? We've seen tons of master plans developed, but the actual plan for implementation that would actually bring investment capital was what was needed. And so a little over almost 2 years ago, I joined Buccini Pollin Group to help in that effort. We also combined with our private equity investors who had similar alignment with our values. So Clay Cove Capital joined in that. And then we had an anchor institution with the leadership of Vince DeLee, First National Bank. And so when Councilman Lavelle speaks to the tower, this 26-story tower with 429,000 square feet of rentable space, this was a purposeful tower, a catalytic tower. And so at closing, we were able to help push Councilman Lavelle's legislation around the LERTA, the Local Economic Revitalization Tax Abatement, which meant that $7 million at closing would be delivered to the Greater Hill District. And so there are legislative moves that the councilman has been making, and that political side also needed an economic side on the real estate development end. And so here we are building out that 28-acre site.
Thank you so much, Bomani. This is just the beginning. Dr. Walker?
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to join today's panel. And so I am Diamante Walker, and I've been a lifelong Hill District resident. My family came here about the late 1800s in search of new opportunity as a result of the Industrial Revolution, and we've been here ever since. And so I can tell you that my interest in the project has been, and I've said this multiple times, is I intend for my children to continue to live in this neighborhood, But the reality is that it is in a precipitous state of decline. And so if we are going to leave our children a better neighborhood than the one that we inherited, we need to make strategic investments now to ensure that there's a vibrant neighborhood for them to be a part of. And I think that the Lower Hill redevelopment represents an opportunity to do that. In my previous role at the URA, the Urban Redevelopment Authority, as the Deputy Executive Director, it became very clear to me that the redevelopment of the Lower Hill in isolation would not transform our neighborhood the way that we envisioned the neighborhood being transformed. We needed to ensure that that investment found its way to what we call the middle and upper hill. And so I've worked very closely with the other partners on the panel today to think through creative strategies to ensure that that commensurate investment was occurring. And so working with Councilman Lavelle and his legislative power in the multiple seats and hats that he wears around this development, we were able to push for additional benefit to the neighborhood above and beyond what the CCIP envisioned 7 or 8 years ago. So around 2019, there was a renewed opportunity to begin to think through right now strategies that could be implemented. And as a result of that, a lot of the partners that are around the table now became more directly involved with the project. And so I will say that the project in and of itself is not what drives me. It's the people that have coalesced around the project and the fact that given the rampant displacement that happened in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, we now have an opportunity to repatriate and bring back what we call the Hill District diaspora, to bring people home and to participate in a new economic resurgence. And I've been, very fortunate and very blessed to be a part of that, both as a practitioner and in my personal capacity. And I'm here today because I intend to continue to push for equitable development in the Lower Hill.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walker. Tracy McCants-Lewis.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'd like to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here. As Dr. Ellis said, again, my name is Tracy McCants-Lewis. I represent the Pittsburgh Penguins. I serve now as Chief People Officer and General Counsel. When I joined the Pittsburgh Penguins almost 4 seasons ago, I came, again, just working in HR and working as Deputy General Counsel. But one of the reasons that I was very interested in taking the position with the Pittsburgh Penguins was because I was going to be working with Kevin Affleck. Kevin Affleck also worked on creating the CCIP plan with Councilman Lavelle, Bomani House, and others, but in his capacity as a member of the previous administration for the mayor's office. So he drafted and assisted with drafting that community benefits agreement with the community in mind, making sure the community was going to get what they deserve to get with the Pittsburgh Penguins' involvement. And so now he serves as the president of the organization. And so coming in as a Black woman, I wanted to be around the table. I wanted to be at the organization that was going to be working with the community to ensure that the community would get what they deserve. And working in concert with the Pittsburgh Penguins, working in concert with the Hill District community and others that serve on what is called the EMC, which is the Executive Management Committee of that Community Benefits Agreement. And so in my role, I try to work, again, to be that in-between between the organization, the Pittsburgh Penguins, and the community. I live on the north side of Pittsburgh. I am not a lifelong Hill District resident, but I do have a heart for the community. As a black woman from the city of Pittsburgh, I have a heart for the people that live in that community.
Okay, thank you so much, Tracy. And so, part of my personal story, I co-sign what everybody said. I just want to say that, especially because so many of you are from out of town, and you may or may not know the history of the Hill District. The historic Hill District is literally one of Pittsburgh's oldest communities and one of America's most famous communities, and that's because of the works of August Wilson, playwright who wrote stories about the Hill District. You may have heard of Fences, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, The Piano Lesson, stories like that. We also have a number of other famous people, but I think theater has really captivated a lot of people's imagination. And full transparency, I am August Wilson's niece, so I did grow up hearing about these stories and learning about these people. In 2008, though, the Hill District led the charge in signing the first community benefits agreement in the state of Pennsylvania. So you need to know that this story happens way before this development. And even before then, one of the things that I'm known for is protesting the proposed casino that was to be in the Lower Hill. And that was actually led by the Pittsburgh Penguins. And in full context, basically, the Pittsburgh Pirates got a new stadium, and then the Pittsburgh Steelers got a new stadium. And so the Pittsburgh Penguins were saying, well, we want a new stadium. We need a new arena. But by that time, the taxpayers were really worn out. And a referendum was put on the ballot, and the taxpayers actually voted it down and said, like, we don't want to pay for it. So the Penguins had to find somebody else, basically, who was going to pay for their arena, and they decided that a good idea would be to coalesce with the coming Pennsylvania Gaming Board, which was allowing the casinos to come in. And so I get financially why they would say, well, yeah, I mean, we should get a casino and it'll pay for our arena since the taxpayers don't want to pay. The problem is that the casino was going to be put in the front yard of our vulnerable neighborhood, which I describe as having one foot in development and the other in abandoned lots and buildings. And so I protested that development. And Governor Rendell actually said, well, you know, since there's a lot of a lot of resistance and discussion around where the casino should go, I will create a plan B. I'll lift this up out of the hands of the people having to depend upon a casino, and I'll say whoever gets the casino license has to buy the arena for the Pittsburgh Penguins. So that changed the game in that discussion. And so the casino ended up on the north side. Some of you all may have visited it. It's Rivers Casino on the north side, and then the Lower Hill District still got the casino. And when that decision was made, basically it was written about in the paper and their official report that the negative impact on the community was a deciding factor in not giving the Pittsburgh Penguins the casino. So that was a victory for myself. A lot of people, it was a victory for our community. A lot of people even in my community were mad at me. But it's a long story, and I don't have time to tell that story, but that's the background of it, that I had initially protested what I considered to be a poor development plan that was going to negatively affect my community. So then why would I then turn around years later? In the middle of that period, my mom, she got sick, she had dementia, and I stepped away from all community organizing just to take care of her. When I emerged, these discussions were going on. So I knew very little about, I heard things, but I really was not attuned to the discussions. And basically I got a call from the Buccini Pollin Group, and to be honest with you all, I was pretty rude. And they were really just calling to find out if I wanted to get more information from them, if I wanted to be on the newsletter, but I knew somebody gave them my number, so I was offended by that alone. And then I was like, sure, you can send me your lies. That's what I was thinking in my head, right? And so months later, I received a call, and they were asking, there's so much here, but basically after I finished caregiving for my mother, somebody sent me a call for artists, and it was to work on the first neighborhood park, which is now, it was then called the CAP Park, or the I-579 Park. And they needed a historian, they needed an artist, and the community actually demanded that artists from the historic Hill District work on that project. I was chosen to work on that project, and I was the historian for the project and also an artist. If you haven't been to the Frankie May Pace Park, you should definitely see it. Just through circumstance, it happens to be the first physical manifestation of what Joe Biden and others have envisioned in the Build Back Better plan to reconnect communities. We were supposed to be done years ago, but with COVID and all these other things, we broke ground last November. So this is the evidence. And basically, it's an unapologetic celebration of a historically African American and mixed community right there in what we would consider now to be downtown. But the Hill District actually used to go all the way down, to the courthouse. So all of that to say, I was contacted because they wanted someone who would serve as an artistic consultant and a historian to the project. And I was skeptical for all the reasons that, well, I didn't know all the reasons that Daniel Lavelle outlined before, but I was just skeptical, period. And then somebody, it wasn't them. I think I reached out to Daniel Lavelle and I said, like, these people are calling me, like, what do they want? Do you know anything about them? And he said, oh, I sent them to you. And I was like, you could have saved me so much anxiety if you had told me that you sent them to me, right? And that's so Councilman Lavelle. So then he said, oh, and you should talk to Bomani. And, Bomani's on the project. And I was like, Bomani's on the project? Again, this was like a piece of, so there was more trust because I grew up with these people, because I was recommended by them. And that made all the difference in the world. And there's, the story goes on, but that is what was the defining factor for me to say, sure, I'll come on and be a consultant. And you need the correct history anyway, so I'll be more than happy to do it. And then in the process of working with the team and researching Buccini Pollin Group and so on and so forth, I said, I think I could actually work with these people. So 4 months after my consultation, I was hired as the Director of Community Arts and Culture for the Buccini Pollin Group. And I'm actually very proud of that now. I mean, we were all very skeptical, as I'm sure you've heard. But with the community collaboration and implementation plan, with all of our ideals and goals, we have things. So on your left, I just put up the community collaboration plan. It's called the CCIP. We have so many acronyms on this project, but the community collaboration and implementation plan is on your left, and we can talk about that some more. And one of the last things I just want to mention, because you see it on the screen, is that there's an executive management committee. So people like Councilman Lavelle, they serve on that committee, and people like Tracy Lewis, they serve on the committee. Bomani and myself, we report to that committee. So the developer and the development is held accountable with our reporting, with our tracking, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that, and I'll pull up a different image, especially when Bomani starts talking about MWBE and impact. But there's multiple levels of accountability. So in sum, for this intro, what we're looking at here is a very empowered and organized community that produced protests, activism, demands, produced the first community benefits agreement, produced this CCIP plan. Then you have a government that was willing to accept the way that the government's responsibility had been wrong. In the 1950s, the Lower Hill, Pittsburgh was chosen as the first urban redevelopment project. And so they were the first to receive federal funds. In order to receive those federal funds, they created the Urban Redevelopment Authority. These days, we hear development authority all across the United States, but Pittsburgh was the first. And quite frankly, Pittsburgh botched it. And so now this is only the second development that will ever happen in the history of Pittsburgh in this Lower Hill. So it really matters what happens. It mattered what the outline would be. It mattered, everything about it mattered. So I just wanted to say those things. And then, so you have the government accountability, and then you have a corporate citizen in the form of the Pittsburgh Penguins, in the form of Fnb Bank, in the form of Buccini Pollin Group, that is actually known for putting into and building communities. Buccini Pollin Group is from Wilmington, Delaware, and so they were actually known for like building up the riverfront, building up basically a dreary community. And one of the jokes that I heard is that on Saturday Night Live, Wayne's World. Remember Wayne's World? That Wayne's World was set in Delaware, and I didn't know that, and I thought that was so funny. But basically, that's the general image, and so Buccini Pollin Group is known for basically building up that community, not displacing people and destroying communities, and that's a really important background that has to be acknowledged. So you have these three entities coming together to do something bigger than each of them, and to do something bigger for the community. So that's the general backdrop. So let's go back to Councilman Lavelle, especially because we talked about government accountability. Councilman Lavelle, what is the legislation that makes, that would basically have to force any corporate community, any corporation to be accountable to reinvestment in a community?
So there's lots of pieces of legislation that work to do that. Specific to the Lower Hill District site, I can think of a number of pieces. One of the very first pieces of legislation I passed when we started working on this site was when the Civic Arena was demolished, new parking was put in place. And the Pittsburgh Penguins got all the revenue from all the parking on the entire site. Well, again, using my legislative hat, sometimes you have to force an issue upon a developer they don't necessarily wish. And so I passed a bill that basically said, you still get the revenue, but all the taxes that come from the new parking can only be put into a special account held at the URA that can then only be spent in the Greater Hill District community. Normally, the city collects taxes, it goes into our general fund, and we then spend it on a million different things, paving, police, public safety. So that was sort of the first of its kind when I passed that. And at the time, I actually had colleagues who said, no, you can't do that, that's illegal, to dedicate taxes to only one neighborhood. But it did pass, it was absolutely legal. And so that was one of the very first pieces of legislation. One of the other big pieces of legislation that sort of helped move this development forward is the LRTA that Buccini mentioned, which is essentially a tax abatement. However, in this scenario, we drew a line around the entire Hill District community. And we said all the future tax revenue that is going to come from this billion-dollar development gets split in twofold, and it's projected to be about $80 million in tax revenue that's going to come from this development over the next 20 to 30 years. And so what we did was we passed a law that said, again, we're going to collect these tax dollars, but these tax dollars can only be spent in the Greater Hill District community. 50% will be spent on the Lower Hill site to help fund infrastructure and things that are necessary to move the development forward, but the other 50% can only be spent in the Greater Hill District, which again, the city had never done something of that nature. The other sort of important piece to that, and Buccini mentioned, it was actually $7.6 million, I think, the check that they had to cut. But what we ended up doing was had a conversation with the developers as we're sort of negotiating out a deal for this tower, and said, look, this tower is going to spin off, let's just say $13–15 million over the course of the next 20 to 30 years. Unfortunately, I don't have 20 to 30 years. My people don't have 20 to 30 years to slowly receive $150,000 a year to benefit them. I need that money right now. And so that became a negotiation and how to monetize those tax dollars right now. And what ended up happening in Fnb, they were a good partner in this. They essentially they monetized on the front end, made a loan to BPG, who at closing said the present day value of what would be the 13 to 15 million is close to 8 million. So we'll give you those dollars now, and those dollars are now held at the Urban Redevelopment Authority, and there's a community advisory board that is helping to determine how to spend those dollars within the actual community itself, so that as this development gets going, you don't leave the rest of the community behind. Rather, you can actually help them jumpstart and invest in their homes and invest in small businesses along the corridor. Similarly, they're working on another development with, I'm assuming I can say Slab Nation is pretty public, where it's going to be a parking garage with a state-of-the-art theater above it. And in order to make that work, they came to government and said, hey, it'd really be helpful if you all did a parking tax diversion so that we can divert the parking tax revenue that you would get into help funding the project to make the numbers work. And again, it's a negotiation. Well, if you need something, then my people need something. And so ultimately, we decided that we would do the parking tax diversion, which I had to legislate, but we split it up. And we said, you will get some of that revenue, but $7 million of that parking tax revenue that the city's not going to collect is, again, going to be held into a special fund at the URA that can, again, only be deployed back into the rest of the neighborhood. And that $7 million is going to be set aside specifically to fund affordable housing initiatives within the community. The other piece of legislation that really comes to mind, it was birthed out of the Lower Hill but affects the whole city now, is at the time, and this was before BPG was at the table, we were having conversations with the Pittsburgh Penguins about the housing that was supposed to go on the site. And they were proposing 100% market rate housing on the site. So I forget the number, 1,200 units of market rate housing. And I said, that's not going to work because of, unfortunately, because of the economics of Pittsburgh, if you were to do that, the only people that could live there would be upper income white men. And that would have a detrimental effect, the exact opposite effect that we're trying to have on this community. And again, they looked at me and said, well, we have the development rights to the land. There's nothing you can do about it. And unfortunately, they sent it to a legislator who writes laws. So I introduced a bill that essentially said that will require any specially planned district in the city of Pittsburgh, of which the Lower Hill was one, would have to have a minimum of 30% affordable housing in it. And I put it into our zoning code, which, if you understand the zoning code, essentially once you introduce a bill like that, it effectively becomes law until you vote it up or down. And so that essentially paused them in their tracks of what they flipped out. We got back to the table and had conversations. And admittedly, I had to say when I went to before the Planning Commission that I didn't know if this was right. But what I did know is that we had an affordable housing problem in the city. I did know we shouldn't be building housing that only upper income white men should be able to afford. But that I didn't know if this bill was right. I was just doing something because no one else was willing to have a conversation. What we ultimately ended up doing was I ended up tabling that bill. In exchange, working with the former mayor at the time, Mayor Bill Peduto, he agreed that if I tabled that bill, because it affected the entire city, that we would introduce legislation to create an affordable housing task force, where we would actually bring in experts from across the country to study the issue to figure out what was necessary, how much affordable housing did we need, at what levels of AMI. And so we introduced that bill, created the task force, studied it, and came back with numerous recommendations. But the first recommendation was, given dwindling federal and state resources, you, the city, are going to have to figure out a way to have a dedicated source of revenue to fund this. And that ultimately ended up with another piece of legislation that I did, which was to create what was called the Housing Opportunity Fund now, where the city now diverts $10 million into a special fund to fund affordable housing initiatives throughout the city. So the Lower Hill has produced lots, and there's others, but I don't want to monopolize, but the Lower Hill initiative and trying to hold both the developer accountable, but also, in my opinion, holding government accountable, because it was government who tore down the community in the 50s. And so using every opportunity that we have to hold ourselves accountable, and again, to my very early point, to leverage this development to pour resources back into the greater community.
Thank you so much. And as you heard Councilman Lavelle talk about shared prosperity, what happens in the Lower Hill, it has to affect the middle and the upper hill. And to that end, Bomani House, I wanted to ask you about the MWBE program, wealth building, this concept of shared prosperity. What's actually happening in the development that you can share with the audience?
So I want to thank Councilman for laying out those legislative policies that he put in place, because it makes, on the development side, it helps us to do what we call transformational development. I just want to go back to the housing point. So the legislation pushed for 80, 70, and 60% AMI, area median income. And if you look at that, if you break that all the way down, it makes sure that somebody making a little over $16 an hour can afford to be able to stay in those units. And so 20 to 30% of those units, it's slated for 1,200 units, right? And so the reason why that's important is because the Hill District has pretty much like 3 buckets of income. You have like 35,000, then it drops down to 24, and then 18,000, and even as low as down to $7,900 a year some folks are making. Now, the reason why that happened is because the city, long ago, back in the 20s and 30s, put 90% of the housing projects, of the city's housing project in one neighborhood, in our neighborhood, the Hill District. And so how do you rebuild that? It's with these type of legislative policies and the type of investment capital that comes in when you have progressive development. And so in that, to get to your question about MWB participation, the CCIP, what we referred to earlier, is called the Community Collaborative Implementation Plan. And it calls for 30% minority and women, 30% minority participation and 15% women-owned businesses participating. That's double what the city requires, 15 and 7, right? And so the reason we did that is because we oftentimes get left out of development projects, right? It is a very cutthroat business in construction. And oftentimes small businesses don't have the capacity. But what we've been able to do in the Lower Hill development is that with these set expectations of 30 and 15, of the little over $100 million in awards, we've been able to achieve $30 million in the MWBEs. But we didn't stop there. We said it's not enough. We want to make sure that African Americans in particular, because we've been the focus of those discriminatory practices that blocked us out of the unions, that blocked us from getting housing that would later get us small business loans for businesses, leveraging the equity in our homes. And so we said that we would agree to making sure that we would record the amount of awards that are going to African American owned businesses. And so to date, we have $24 million in contracts off the Fnb Tower.
Thank you so much, Bomani. And on the screen is actually our July report, because we do report every single dollar that is spent on everyone, and then we break down the MWBEs. You can see the percentage of women, and it is pretty funny that in this particular report for July, we actually don't have a minority or women businesses, but this is a really small contract, and we report month by month. But you heard Bomani, you can look at the percentages, and you heard Bomani talk about, you can see here that we're at 33.47% MBE and at 7.81%. And I think that what's really important is that we are much higher than what the city actually requires, and the CCIP projected double what the city requires, and that we're just up under that number. And so we're just starting, but it is something, it is making a difference, and it's something that's really important. Diamante Walker, can you talk really briefly in our last few minutes here about, is there anything that you want to reflect upon in terms of the URA and like legislation or government or the avenues of hope that relate to this development in the historic Hill District?
Absolutely. I think Councilman Lavelle did a really excellent job of sort of underpinning the impact that legislation has on being able to codify intent. And I think what we saw happen decades ago was that there really, the legislation was not designed to protect community interest, and it was not designed to think about, again, how to maximize the public investment going into the site to make sure that it benefited more than just the developer. And so looking at avenues of hope in particular, I spoke earlier about ensuring that the Lower Hill development serves as a catalyst for development in the broader neighborhood. And so the Avenues of Hope sort of campaign, is what I will call it, was a way to rethink how public investment is driven towards Black neighborhoods to then attract private investment in a way that does not spur gentrification and prioritizes affordable housing, the inclusion of minority and women-owned businesses, as well as keeping intact the cultural fabric within a neighborhood. When we talk about gentrification, we're really talking about cultural erasure. And so being able to do development in a way where you are not prioritizing the housing and economic development needs of wealthy white men, and instead you are thinking about the entire economic strata, is one of the reasons why I believe that the Lower Hill will emerge as a model. And so I'm going to point to the Center Avenue redevelopment that is happening, that is currently underway. It's a very methodical, glacial process, but there's some intentionality behind that because speed in development can sometimes kill, right? There are very weak development muscles in the Hill District, given the amount of time that we've been experiencing, I guess what you could term benign neglect. And so now we want to do that development in a way that allows us to take small business owners and convert them into property owners within the neighborhood, reclaiming publicly owned land for some level of community control. And so the Ham's Barber Shop, which is a iconic building in the Hill District on the corner of Center Avenue and Kirkpatrick, and that particular development is directly tethered to the Lower Hill, where we've taken a barber who's been in the neighborhood, grew up in the neighborhood, has been in the neighborhood with a business for 15 years. And we've been able to build a partnership between the Urban Redevelopment Authority, the Buccini Pollin Group, Fnb to try to support that development. So as you see that tower going up in the Lower Hill, you also see the Ham's Barbershop coming back to life as Tom's Barbershop. And to see those two things happening in tandem, sort of that macro level development that will impact our city more broadly, and then that micro level development that will impact our community and our neighborhood more directly. I think that's emblematic of what we've tried to do to restore hope into people who are oftentimes told that development is bad. Development is an instrument for, harming neighborhoods. I think that's a fallacy, and I think that the Hill District has been done a great disservice to believe that any and all development is detrimental to the neighborhood. When you have leaders such as yourself, Dr. Ellis, leaders like Tracy, Buccini, and Councilman Lavelle, when you have folks like us around the table committing to doing this in a way that is equitable, transparent, and fair, not perfect, but equitable, you see different outcomes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Walker. I want to move to our questions and answers because I know some of you all have some questions. And Tracy, I'll be able to swing right back to you as well when we conclude. Does anyone have any questions in the audience? Yes.
Thank you for this. This has been really interesting. And I'm wondering if you have any. Hello. Hi. My name is Rachel. Thank you again for this. I am just wondering if you have any concrete, I know it's case by case in these developments and neighborhoods, but I guess I'm specifically thinking of Philadelphia. Mm-hmm. Right now there's a lot of things going on with, they want to build a stadium for the 76ers in Chinatown, and there's a lot of anger about this. And I guess I'm curious what you guys think of this and how you think there can be concrete steps to be helping this community and whether, I guess if you guys have any thoughts.
So, yes and no. So, unfortunately, if government truly decides that they want to build that stadium, and I know I have some family in Philly, I know Philly somewhat well, they're going to build that stadium. And so your job then becomes how to maximize whatever happens to that community. One, how to protect the community to the greatest extent possible, how to protect it from gentrification, how to potentially leverage some of the resources that are going to be going into building up that stadium to potentially begin helping the long-term residents fix up their properties, give them facade grants so that they can benefit from the traffic that's going to come there. One example, to give a comparable, is the Live Nation venue I mentioned. Well, there's going to be hundreds of thousands of people coming there on a weekly basis, right? So how does residents from the Hill District benefit? Well, part of what they've agreed to in that development is they're going to carve out space where they're going to give Black businesses free rent. And so you can now be in the heart of the development. You can build up your business and then eventually go elsewhere and get your own real space. Well, they could be easily doing things like that at the stadium. Or how do you take the local restaurants that are in Chinatown and give them below market rent in the actual stadium, the food that everyone locally loves? How do you then put it inside the stadium and give them an opportunity to benefit from all those football fans that are going to be coming? So I think it's less about fighting the actual development, because something like that, once big government decides we're doing this, because at that point you're really talking to the governor's office, you're talking to the state all the way down to your local officials have decided we're all in on preserving our football teams. I wish one day some city would push back on that, but because actually not a good financial deal for the city, but we will lose that fight. But you can take on the local fight of extracting the maximum economic and social benefit, even the physical design of it. How does it reflect the community that it's going to be in? I think it's DC. They built their basketball stadium in Chinatown, but you can still see Chinatown somewhat reflected in the archways that sort of go towards the stadium. So it's all of those sort of things that how do you respect what's already here and protect it to the greatest extent possible? And I'd certainly be more than willing to go offline into the weeds with you, but that's sort of what I think of.
Other questions? And I just want to encourage you all, go to lowerhillredevelopment.com. One, that's our main site. And number two, /CCIP, CCIP. Use this as your blueprint. Use this. This is why we decided to tell this story, because it's not 100% perfect, but it is darn good. And everybody should be this should be your baseline, are these types of engagement and programs and policies. Other questions?
Yes, so I...
Oh, okay, I couldn't
Hi.
see you.
Yeah. So I spent 6 years, I lived in Ward 8 in DC, which is the lowest income ward in DC. When I moved there, it was not what a lot of people were moving there. And I come from a labor background. It was really important to me to try to get out in the community and try to understand some of the issues that were working there. So I say this kind of from a place of like humbly admitting that like my experience is not based on having been like a lifelong resident from the community that I was in. But I know for Ward 8, a lot of the developers came in there and it was supposed to be community development that was based on listening to what residents wanted. And I, through following kind of that process, I'm in that camp of people who are like, I don't believe there's any good development anymore. I came here partly to be convinced that there were other alternatives. But what I saw working is that not necessarily not everybody in a community wants the same thing, right? So even if you go to the community to ask what's supposed to happen, you have class divisions within that neighborhood. And I know for Ward 8, what I saw was a lot of listening to what middle-class folks in the neighborhood wanted, talking to Black-owned businesses, but only talking to certain Black-owned businesses, not talking to the barbershops. So I guess I wanted to know a little bit about how, like, what was the plan for including voices beyond maybe like who comes out to a community meeting, like making sure to get out to those folks who like never are gonna come to a community meeting, which is most of the people who are most vulnerable, I think, to change. Because I'll tell you, out of like probably the 8 closest people that I was closest with in the neighborhood, 2 are dead now, 2 are in jail, and that's just like, that's not like a statistic that I'm comfortable with. I don't think that like changes that were happening in the neighborhood were benefiting the people it was supposed to.
That's a good question. I'm familiar with that development. I worked with the White House Office of Urban Affairs in coordinating a 14 federal agency working group to, you're talking about the development of St. E's, right? So Congress Heights and Anacostia, that whole, it's like the last quarter of DC that hasn't been gentrified. But to just give a very quick answer to your question about how it's old school grassroots organizing. You got to get on the ground. You have to get to those community organizations, and not just you have to be well-rounded in reaching out. You know, you got to get to those small business owners. They might not have good signage out front, but they've been in the community, they've been surviving a long time, they have good history. And make sure you have a well-rounded, I think that's what this panel represents, with Tracy and Diamante, Councilman Lavelle, Dr. Ellis, myself, and so many more people, grassroots outreach to make sure that you get a good representation of community voice.
Yeah.
Can I also add, you know, in addition to what Buccini said, I think that CCIP plan that we have also makes those discussions happen. It's required as part of the CCIP. And then also the City of Pittsburgh, the process by which a developer has to go out and talk to the community, has to document that you've talked to the community. I think those things give us an opportunity to hear from all and hear from a larger representative group than us picking and choosing who we're speaking to. So I think that the processes, whether it be by the CCIP or just the city process, gives us that opportunity to hear from many people.
Absolutely, and if you look on the screen, this is why I directed your attention to this. This is the actual CCIP, and I want everybody to be very clear, all of the parties signed. You can't just have a community meeting where a developer or a politician come and talk at or to the community and say, we assure you, this and this promise and this promise. Oh, okay, you're serious about these promises? Let's write that down. You have to hold everybody to it. It has to be accountable. It doesn't count if it's not written down and signed. This CCIP is a signed document. So you can see it says this plan evolved from ongoing discussions between the Pittsburgh Penguins organization and the Lower Hill Working Group. That's a grassroots that was a grassroots working group from the Hill District. Not from the politician, not from the development. So that when Buccini says grassroots organizing, that Lower Hill Working Group is an example of the grassroots organizing on behalf of the Greater Hill District community with input from the public partners, although not party to this plan, blah, 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 blah. But the whole point is that at the end, subject to the legal responsibilities, obligations, and restrictions placed on them as government entities. This was a contract. And so I think that like everything with regard to the LRTA is a signed document. You have to get those signatures. And I think we learned that lesson from the community benefits agreement. We are the first in the state of Pennsylvania, but to be quite transparent, it wasn't the greatest agreement. Like I didn't even sign it because I felt like we could get more, but we learned and we got more the next time. And that laid the foundation for the Lower Hill Working Group and this CCIP plan that we have now. Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think it's incredible, this collaboration that's been going on with government and the community and developers. I moved to Pittsburgh a few years ago, and I've been hearing about this redevelopment in the Hill District. And recently I've learned more about Bethel AME Church that's in the Lower Hill, and I believe that their property was seized by eminent domain as a part of this URA redevelopment. I'm curious, as you were talking about expanding out into the community and continuing the conversations, is there any talk with Bethel AME about potentially gifting them back that land, that parcel of land, I think it is, that they want to use to rebuild the community as well within the context of the church?
So
I can speak to that specific. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Tracy.
Thank you. Kevin Affleck, and I apologize, I did not give his accurate title right now. Right now, he is the president of business operations for the Pittsburgh Penguins. At the time of contact with Bethel AME, Kevin Affleck was general counsel. He and I drafted an MOU. We're trying to work with Bethel AME to see how the Pittsburgh Penguins can assist them in correcting some of the wrongs that happened when their land was taken by eminent domain by the URA. So the Pittsburgh Penguins are actively working with them, also participating in work with them in that coordinated development, so assisting them with some development that they want to do in the Upper Hill District where their current church is. But again, we are working alongside them to try and get what they are calling for, which is reparations for the taking of their church. So Councilman, I throw it over to you now.
And I'll just add really quickly that, I know the story about Bethel. Bethel actually started in Oakland, and they've had 3 locations. But Bethel's history is very important because during the 1800s, that's where the Colored Convention of 1831 was held here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. And we have a long storied history here. But I want to point out that, one, Bethel AME, they were not the only people that were displaced. They weren't the only African Americans that were displaced. There were 8,000 African Americans that were displaced. So it was one of many things that happened. But here's the difference. The Italian immigrant community that was there, they didn't want St. Peter's, the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church was also taken by eminent domain, but the difference is that St. Peter's Church and like those owners at that time, they were properly compensated. Bethel AME was not properly compensated. And so it's not so much the return of the land, right? Because this is not the 1800s, we're far, but can they, is there proper repair for the removal of that property and the lack of proper compensation? And the answer is absolutely yes.
Correct. And exactly, Dr. Ellis, I agree with that. They were not properly compensated, whereas some of the other churches, and I'm not sure with some of the synagogues that were also taken, what they received. But for example, I believe it was the Roman Catholic Church that got $2 million. Mm-hmm. And I think Bethel AME got around $200,000.
Yes. So, and as I told you all before, I mean, for this to be the first Urban Redevelopment Authority, the City of Pittsburgh, and, its government entity, they botched it. And now we have people like, I mean, who knew, right, that, literally, are we almost 100 years later, we would have, people from the neighborhood. Our former state representative, who's now chief of staff of the first black mayor, Ed Gainey, is Jake Wheatley, and he was our state representative for 16 years or something like that, and he's a Historic Hill resident. City Councilman Daniel Lavelle is a Historic Hill resident. So it's amazing how things change, and ironically enough, things shift, and we now have people in the proper place to actually advocate properly, for what has happened. But quite frankly, the city of Pittsburgh botched the entire urban redevelopment that occurred in that time period, and now they have another opportunity to do it right. So I think that's perfect timing for us to conclude. I want to thank you all so much for coming, for your attentiveness. I know this was the last session, individual session at Netroots Nation, and thank you all so much. We'll be here to answer other questions. Please do go to lowerhillredevelopment.com. And I want to give a shout out to our social media manager, Aaliyah McMullen, and our street team manager. She actually came from another event. And I was like, can you come from Community Day to come cover our panel? And so we're really happy to be here, happy to represent for you all. Thank you so much, Tracy McCann-Lewis. Thank you, Dr. Diamante Walker. Thank you, City Councilman Daniel Lavelle, and Bomani House, Dr. Kimberly Ellis, and I appreciate you all coming.